This ZeroNow program is brought to you with the support of our founding partners.
I'm just one person.
Determined
to bring us back to zero.
I'm just one person.
Determined
to bring us back to zero.
I am just one person.
Determined to bring us back to zero.
All right, folks. Welcome. I'm Ara Bagdasarian, the board president of ZeroNow and founder of OmniAlert, and welcome to this ZeroNow sessions about funding school safety with grants that are available today. Sessions is a forum to exchange big ideas and best practices for safer schools nationwide. Just by background, ZeroNow is a stakeholder alliance formed to drive ideas, innovation, and investment to advance school safety. As a membership-based nonprofit, ZeroNow facilitates collaboration between industry, association, and education partners to foster new solutions that keep our campuses safe and secure. Before we get started, we just want to recognize our sponsors and founding partners who made this program possible. Thanks to Access Communications, Additional Corporation, OmniAlert, Johnson Controls, IACLEA, the VTV Family Outreach Foundation, NASPA, the Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education, and Campus Safety Magazine and Conferences. If you're interested in learning more about becoming a member, please visit ZeroNow.org. Now, before we get started here introducing our special guest, please take a moment to respond to this first poll. The question is, how many of you have applied for either the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, Nsgp, or School Violence Prevention Program, SVPP grants? So while you're answering that question, give you a minute to do that. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our special guest, Elisa Mula. Elisa formed EM Designs in 2004 to help clients achieve their security objectives through a comprehensive approach to assessing threats, funding safety programs, and developing best practices. Ms. Mula received her master's degree in protection management from John Jay College. During this time, she expanded her knowledge of security grants as well as physical security and how technologies play a larger role within a variety of security programs. Elisa is here today to share her extensive knowledge and expertise in identifying, securing, and implementing grants focused on improving school safety. Welcome, Elisa.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Elisa, before we get started, let's go ahead and take a look at those poll results. Let's go ahead and share that here. Okay. Wow. So most of our participants have not applied for either the grant program. So that's just as a point of reference as we're speaking here. So it looks like there's a lot of foundational learning that I think we need to focus on.
Yeah, and I think that with all the recent events, there's a lot more focus on some of the grants. We're seeing an influx of money from some of the new bills that have passed, some reallocation from the American Rescue Plan, and everyone's ears are perking up when you start talking grants and funding. So.
Yep, no doubt about that. Let's go ahead and stop that share. So while you're opening your presentation, Elisa, I just want to remind our participants, if you have questions for Elisa, please enter them in the Q&A window. You could also chat in the during the chat session, but go ahead and click the Q&A if you have questions. We'll address those towards the end of the presentation.
Can I go ahead and start sharing?
It's all you. Yes, please, Elisa.
Awesome. Okay, great. So just to add a little bit of my background to what Ara already mentioned, I do have a small security consulting practice, and this is really just one, in my opinion, very important arm of that practice, which is focusing on security assessments specifically for grant applications, and then helping those applicants through the process. And of course, all of the consulting that goes on after the fact once you've won a grant award. As Ara mentioned, I did study at John Jay, and this was really my initial entry into grants and the grant program. CUNY Research, which John Jay is part of the CUNY network, they had a phenomenal program. It was called the TVA program. And the first year I participated, I got trained on these specific assessments. We got to learn a lot about different types of terrorist activity and what these grants were looking for in regard to facility hardening and what could be applied for each individual applicant's facility. So it was a very, very thorough training process. And then the second year, I was able to really work more on the administrative side, running the program. And I loved it. It was such a good service for the community. And we got to work with some phenomenal graduate students, a lot of whom were law enforcement, military, other security consultants, and a lot of those folks I work with still to this day. And so every year since then, even after the CUNY research program closed, which it's a shame that program did close, but every year since then, I've gotten contracted by other organizations to do this work. And a lot of times we work with clients that don't have the funds to not only install cameras, but to pay for consultants to help them through this process. So I often do a lot of pro bono work. I try not to advertise that too much, but again, it's a really important thing now more than ever that every school, every nonprofit, every house of worship, every hospital has enough of a security practice and procedures and training on a regular basis to make sure that the community is safer, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about a few different grants today. We're mostly going to focus on the Nsgp, which is probably one of the more popular grants. And that is a federal program. And it probably gives away the most amount of money annually. This year, fiscal year 22, the Nsgp awarded over $250 million in funding. Each individual grant is roughly around $150,000 per location. So for anyone who is a nonprofit and is interested, if you have a campus and you have 5 buildings, you can submit a grant for $150,000 for each building. So that would be obviously 5 grants. For the COPS grant, that's also definitely a more popular one. And we're going to talk a little bit about this one as well. But this one in fiscal year 22 was a total of $53 million. However, each one of these awards are roughly around $500,000 per award. So that's a good, healthy amount of money to add to your budget if you're looking to add cameras, locks, whatever. And then there are state and local programs in New York City, which is, I'm in the Northeast, and I've done over the last decade or so, I've done a few state and local grants, mostly in the Northeast. There's the New York City Hate Crime Grant, and roughly the state and local grants, the ones that I've seen, are somewhere around $50,000 to $75,000. Also, not too bad if you just need something to supplement your budget, but there's really nothing stopping you from applying for multiple grants year after year. A lot of the clients that I work with, they apply for the Nsgp every single year. And once you sort of get into the process of it, you have a lot of your documentation ready, and the process gets easier and easier. When you're first starting out, it's overwhelming and incredibly daunting, which is why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. But once you get the hang of it, it actually gets easier, whether you're applying for the Nsgp, the COPS, or any of the state and local grants.
Elisa, quick question. So Nsgp, so can schools K through 12 and higher education schools apply for that grant as well?
Yep. So we're gonna dig into that one a lot today.
Okay,
But that's okay. I like the questions. Please keep them coming. So the Nsgp is for nonprofit security grant program. If you are most of the schools that apply for the Nsgp are private schools and they're nonprofits. For the COPS grant, that is specific to schools. So it's the Stop School Violence Prevention Program. I can't remember the exact acronym. So that is specific to schools. For the state and locals, they're all a little bit different. But if it's a security focused grant, when you look at them, side by side, a lot of the questions in the application are fairly similar. A lot of them will require that you have some level of a security assessment in order to apply. And this is another thing that I want to remember to mention. We've expanded our program. So, I've been doing this again more than a year, but really just in the last few years during COVID, where it really forced us to reevaluate how we're doing these grants. And if we can't get on site, how do we help people do their own assessments? And that is allowable. In fact, the federal grant program, the Nsgp, they provide you with a ton of documentation on how to do your own assessment. So if you don't have the funds to hire somebody like me or hire another security professional, you can, at least just to have a shot at the grant, you can do your own assessment. So each grant's a little bit different. So you have to really figure out which grant you can apply for, depending on whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're a school, healthcare, whatever. And then we have some team members that we've brought on board that are very specific and specialize in state and local grants, and then a few others that specialize in all grants. So even if it's not a security focused grant, we can at least, scour our databases and see what grants, if you're a hospital, what grants hospitals can go after, where some of the funding can be spent on security related equipment.
Awesome. And we have a quick question here from Brian Jones. He asked, I promise to get to the next slide eventually.
No, I like the questions, please.
So Brian asks, how do you retrieve the list of Nsgp winners?
Well, they really don't like to make that information public for obvious reasons. If you attend any of the federal webinars, you will see just how many people apply, or consultants that log on to those webinars. And a lot of them, there is a Q&A session after every single one of these webinars where people will get on and share their experiences, whether they're a school or house of worship. So you can start connecting with folks in this community through some of the webinars, but for obvious reasons, the federal government or state and local governments are not going to publish a list on here's all the people that we had to give grant money to because they don't have enough security.
Got it. And okay, one last question before we move on. So Jeff Lemon asks, can a state college apply for the Nsgp grant?
I don't believe so. If they are already receiving funding, if they're not a nonprofit, then they can't. You have to be a nonprofit for the Nsgp. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But, there are other means of funding. In fact, that is a great segue to this next slide. So some of the more current events in regard to grant funding for safety and security measures, there's two things I want to mention. First and foremost, if you haven't heard, there was a new bill put forth and just passed. It's S111, I believe, the Luke and Alex School Safety Act. So Alex Schechter was unfortunately murdered during the Parkland shooting, and his father went on a massive campaign to not only raise awareness around all of the things that you can do to prevent your school from becoming the next, Columbine, Parkland, Uvalde, whatever it is. And he put forth a tremendous legislative effort, which is the School Safety Act. And part of that bill is outlining funds, and please don't quote me, but I believe it's $300 million that is going to go to the Stop School Violence Prevention Program. So, excuse me. So, this just happened right after Uvalde, and this is you and I spoke about this a little bit. This is typically what happens when an event like Uvalde or Parkland happens. You start to get on this roller coaster of everyone wants to throw money at this, everyone wants attention, and all of a sudden, the school that didn't have the budget before and now all of a sudden has the budget. But, after a few months or a few years, that attention sort of, wanes a little bit, and your redirected funds now go to whiteboards or after school programs. And in our community, and I know you know this, Ara, but in our community, all of the folks that are really focused on school safety truly believe that there has to be a national standard. And we often reference what happened in the fire life safety side of things when, people were dying in school fires. All of a sudden now we have fire life safety code. Well, why don't we have the same on the active threat life safety code? And what happens when a consultant, whether it's myself or another consultant, will come in and say, look, you have to do, or even if it's just active shooter training, here are the things that you have to do to protect yourself against an active shooter. And sometimes people will say, well, that's not fire life safety code compliant. Why do the two have to butt heads? Why aren't there more people legislatively looking at this saying, the two can coexist, and let's really outline what's needed so that people stop dying because somebody left the door open at the school, or they were able to walk in with a gun totally undetected. There's ways around target hardening, and we've been utilizing those measures for decades now. So we know what has to be done. We just have to create that standard to make sure it's being done across the map, right?
Exactly.
So with that being said, the American Rescue Plan, and the last few months, the Biden administration publicly announced that they are encouraging, I think they're trying to set aside $10 billion of American Rescue Plan funding, or trying to reinforce that the states use that funding for public safety purposes. So again, we're sort of on that roller coaster. We're, up high and everyone's paying attention to it. And here come all of these funds. Well, do people actually know how to get their hands on these funds, whether you're a nonprofit or school or a hospital system or whatever? And it's not, I know we're talking about schools here, but this is across the board. There's a lot of active threat. It's not just shooters. There's a lot of active threat activity. We saw the Tops shooting in Buffalo. There was the recent, I think it was a mall shooting. So this is happening everywhere. And there are things that we can do. We just need to sort of set those standards across the map to keep everybody safe.
Definitely.
All right. I hope that answered the question.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about grants, again, we're going to keep, just for today's purposes, there's a lot of them out there. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I shared a document with a laundry list of links state by state, and all the federal information and the COPS grant information, all of this stuff. I'm sharing it with your audience. If anyone has questions on it, please don't hesitate, reach out. But for the purposes of today's conversation, we're just going to really sort of hone in on the Nsgp. So again, the Nsgp will award $150,000 per facility. And if you have multiple facilities, you can apply multiple times in a single year, as long as each one has its own physical address. And when you look at the bigger picture, well, you have to invest a little bit in a really good, solid quality assessment that's going to position you to be a fantastic candidate to receive this grant. But that little bit of investment could yield you well over $300,000, depending on, how many sites you have. And you can also use that assessment for some of the state and local grants that require it. And those are $50,000, $75,000. So depending on how aggressively you really research and go after these grants, you could win year after year a significant amount of money for your security budget. With that said, however, not all assessments are created equal. I've definitely seen a lot of quality assessments, and they're thorough in that they're very specific in pointing out some of the vulnerabilities in each space. However, they don't necessarily always align with the specific grant that you're applying for. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and what that looks like. But just as an example, if and from one security professional to another, they might look at your facility differently. They might say, well, you have glass everywhere, so you definitely need some security glass film, and your intention is to apply for locks because your locks are falling apart. And if you're asking for locks in your application, but your assessment is talking about security glass film and doesn't even mention locks, that's really going to hurt you in the process. So you want to make sure that your assessment is lining up to your application, and you want to make sure all the information is, of course, accurate. But ultimately, you want to look through that assessment and make sure that you're asking for the right types of equipment or training. And then a lot of people will say, well, we just went through this whole grant application process and now we're done and we can relax. And there is a period of time where most people just totally forget the whole process and all that they went through and figuring out what they're going to ask for funding and how much. And then they win the grant. Several months later, they get the grant award letter and they're like, oh yeah, I have to start looking at this again. That's where the hard part really starts. Because the amount of hoops, and we're just sort of focusing on the Nsgp, but some of the other grant programs are equally as daunting in terms of going back and forth and really confirming what you're requesting funds for, if it's allowable in that grant, and all the documentation that has to go along with that process so that you can get your reimbursements. Some grants are reimbursement based, some will just match your existing budget. And that's why you really have to understand the type of grant that you're going after. They're not all the same. But that initial sort of shock of, I have to publish an ad in the paper and I have to get 3 bids and I have to start evaluating different products, all of a sudden, that's when the real work begins, and it's overwhelming. So in the last few years, we've really started to up that side of our offering just to keep people on track, because applicants will ask for extensions year after year because they cannot figure out the grant process. And we don't want you to forfeit your funds just because of this daunting process. And we're going to help you. That's typically what we do. Okay.
And Elisa, just to remind folks, and you did mention this. So following the webinar, when we release the replay of this webinar, we're also going to include a key takeaway. So the documents and links and everything that you were referring to will be in that key takeaways document. So you can look for that in the next week. I want to make sure that the attendees are aware of that.
Yep. And I did add the actual links in the slides in case anybody wants to look it up really quickly. But, and if anything that I'm saying here, if you start doing your research, I don't charge for phone calls. If you have a question, I'm happy to help you, reach out to me. And I also, I didn't mention this earlier, but with anyone who engages with our team, we always offer to review if they have an existing assessment, we always offer to at least review their assessment before we begin the process and working together. And I'm happy, we've done this for years. We've always offered like a review session and maybe some other points if they want to add or have their security person add to the assessment some points that maybe they were missing. We don't charge for that type of evaluation. We want to make sure that you're as positioned as you possibly can be for a successful grant application. So with that said, going to the Nsgp site or FEMA's site that talks about the Nsgp grant, the first thing I often mention, and this is something new in terms of our practice. I didn't realize, I guess, in the 10 years of doing this type of work, how many people go into this process thinking, oh, well, I just saw this really cool new technology and I want to deploy it all across the school. Let's go get a grant. If you don't do your homework and you don't check to make sure that the grant that you're applying for will in fact allow you to spend funds on that particular product, you could waste a lot of time and effort thinking, or if you're a manufacturer, advising your client that they can just get grant funding and it'll pay for their product. You really have to do your homework and make sure that your product is, number one, allowable, but then also follow up with any kind of documentation as per the grant you're applying for. In this particular case, this example, this is the Nsgp website or FEMA's website for the Nsgp grant for the allowable authorized equipment list. And this is an interactive database search. So let's just say it's a mass notification tool, and you want to make sure that your client, or if you are the client, if you're the applicant, you want to make sure that you can purchase this mass notification tool, and this is what you need in your facility. You can go onto this list and type in either Nsgp codes or mass notification tool, and it will pull up all of the codes that you need to have during the application process. I also tell people, even if you find your code and you're convinced, 100% sure this is what I have to apply for, check it anyway, because there are There's a lot of information. This list has not been updated in 2 years, even though it's a very robust site and it has so much information. You could be on the site for 2 weeks and have so much to read. There is a little bit of a lag. So there might be equipment in this list that you will not find on this specific website. But I always advise people either reach out to your state rep or reach out to FEMA to say, this is the product I'm interested in, and I think this is the code that matches up. Please confirm. Because if you go through this process and then you find out really late in the game, several months later, when you've invested all this time and money and effort, that you can't buy the product you thought you were going to buy, it's going to be a difficult day. So definitely take a look at this before you start the process and triple check with your local reps and FEMA reps. So if you want to just start digging into the process, again, we're looking at Nsgp. This is definitely one of the more popular ones. And this website, not only is it going to give you your own self-assessment tool, the preparedness grant manual, which they update quite frequently, and you can look through all of the previous ones, but also that step-by-step guide on how to apply. And we'll dig into that a little bit as well. There's so much really good information on this website. And this is, of course, this is at the federal level, but you do still need to contact, as you're applying, once you're getting ready to apply, you do need to contact your state reps as well. And we're going to look at that right now, what that looks like. So the way Nsgp breaks down their grant process, they list it in 4 parts. I wouldn't have chosen to break it down into these 4 parts, but they're important to cover anyway. That first piece, which is finding or connecting with your state administrative agency. We're going to dig into that. I'm going to show you exactly where to look. Getting a UEI number. And I would love to see how many people in the audience, maybe they can just give a thumbs up or something. How many people know what a UEI number is? This is something that's new this year. Well, awesome. We got one.
One. All right. Nail the thumbs up there.
So this threw everybody for a loop this year. Oh, we got another one. So in fiscal year 22, we went from the DUNS number to the UEI number. And a lot of people, a lot of applicants that I've worked with didn't even know what a DUNS number was, but we're going to dig into that. And if you are even considering applying for the Nsgp, start now with trying to find out what your UEI number is. And then the sub-materials, we're going to talk specifically about the Nsgp materials, what you need to prepare. And again, you could start right now, even though the grant window is far, far away. Just, give yourself plenty of time, and then the submittal process. So let's just dig into that really quickly. So the first thing, after you are certain this is the grant you want to go after, it's going to cover all the material that you think you need. You want to connect with your state rep immediately and just get on their radar, let them know that you're going to be applying in fiscal year 23, and any information they can share, any links, anything that you can start preparing for, they will send this to you. They are going to be your best point of contact throughout the whole process, especially if you don't have someone like us on your team that can sort of guide you through this process. This is going to be your go-to. This is going to be the person who answers all of your questions. So get on their radar early, and they're going to be giving you the instructions with the deadlines for submittals and all of that. It's going to come straight from your state reps. And it's very easy. Like, you can literally just click on one of these links, look up your state, and there's your person. Again, this is not always kept up to date, but if you do reach out to them, they will at least redirect you to the person who is managing all of the grant information for your state. Now let's talk about that UEI number. So I'm just going to explain what happened this year. So if anyone is familiar with what a DUNS number is, or Dun & Bradstreet number, that's your organization's number that is, attached to your site, your facility, your organization, and it's used in a lot of different settings. And if you don't have it, maybe reach out to your accounting team, or if you have a CPA, I'm sure they can point you in the right direction of how to find that number. This year, If you had a DUNS number, you automatically got reassigned to a unique entity identifier, or a UEI number. So when this happened, FEMA came out with an announcement to all grant applicants that you're no longer allowed to use your DUNS number. You have to get your UEI. And this came out within a few days of the grant window opening. So people were, maybe not a few days, maybe it was a month or so, but people were scrambling, trying to figure out, how do I get my UEI? And FEMA did a great job at explaining the process, but and it has to do with going on to sam.gov and looking up your information and all that. But sam.gov got so inundated with requests for UEIs, people were just not getting the support that they needed. So they made a special exception for fiscal year 22 only, that you were able to apply with your DUNS number, but by the time you were awarded a grant and ready to receive those funds, you better have this UEI number. So if you have not started that process, do it now. This is the website. It does give you a step-by-step, but you're going to need the UEI number regardless. So it's a great time to start that process.
I did look up some UEIs, and very important. Glad that you brought it up. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of people, and again, this is why I always urge people to start right away. In the state of New Jersey, they only had a 7-day window to submit their application. So that's insane. I mean, to get all of this material together, all of your information, meanwhile, you're waiting for sam.gov to get back to you on your UEI number, is almost impossible. So just start early.
And start now. And I think that's very important. And part of the ZeroNow community is about being proactive. And so rather than waiting, like you mentioned, the curves with the hills and valleys when it comes to funding, and as a reactive matter, it's important for us, those that are participating in this, to take that proactive mindset and start taking those actions now. Don't wait for something bad to happen and then be reactive to that. Be proactive to prevent something from happening in the first place.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done during the grant application process and after. So you got plenty to do, to do. Part of that is preparing your sub-application materials. So for the Nsgp, and I'm going to add a caveat here, the state and local grants typically are a little bit less competitive than the Nsgp. And you might not need as much information for the state and local grants, but again, those are $50,000 and $75,000. And I say that's a generalization. Some of them might be more or less. I don't know every single one off the top of my head, but for the Nsgp and the COPS grant, you really do have to do your homework. They're not just going to cut you a check because you submit an application. They really want to see that you know what you're talking about and you're going to be spending the funds accordingly, according to their guidelines. So these sub-application materials, this is the stuff that really takes probably the most amount of time during the application process, but it also will make or break your application. So the first thing on this bullet list is connecting with that state agency, because they're going to instruct you on how to do all the rest of this. The next bullet on here is simply your mission statement on a letterhead. And I'm going to come back to this because people think, well, that's easy, I could do that. But there's some stuff to consider. I'm looking at the time because I know we're going to run out of time. The assessment, again, you want to make sure that you have somebody who really understands these grants, and the assessment and your investment justification, which is essentially the application questions, they really do have to sort of coincide and make sure that they're one part of information is backing up the other. So you need to prepare all these materials, review all the materials, give yourself time for adjustments if you need to make some edits, or work with your security professional to add or edit your assessment. You have to give yourself plenty of time to get all of these materials together and then to, of course, submit. So I think I want to speed up a little bit because I know we're running over, but the assessment, I think I made the point. You really want to make sure that everything that's in the assessment, it's thorough, it's accurate. But when you're filling out the answers to the investment justification, especially for the Nsgp, those questions have to be reinforced in that assessment. So we're going to dig into that investment justification as well, but that's what you want to put the two documents side by side and look at your assessment, make sure that everything that's in the assessment is accurate and really backs up the IJ. Your mission statement. So people think this is pretty simple. I've seen mission statements that are 3 paragraphs long, and then I've seen some that are like one sentence, like, we support the K through 12 market for, this geographic location. That's it. And that doesn't necessarily paint your picture of why you're a good candidate. Some of what the investment justification will ask when it comes to the mission statement is, do you support a specific community within the K through 12? Do you deal with special needs kids? Are you affiliated with a religious organization? If you're a hospital system, what are some of the other organizations that participate in the hospital, the overall nonprofit for the hospital? They want to know all this information because they want to know what kind of impact you're going to have if you are a target for terrorist activity, right? So really honing in on how you serve your community is vital in your mission statement. And if it doesn't clearly state that, you might want to sort of revamp that or add a little bit more detail. Okay, so the investment justification, I'm going to try and skip ahead because I think we're going to be running over time, but this is broken down into, this is essentially the application. I mean, the questions in here is what everyone is evaluating, and it's essentially just the application questions. There are other parts and pieces to what we're looking at, but I'm just going to break it down for you just so you can get an idea of the 7 parts of the investment justification. So the first section, which is really just your specific site, your organization, and that physical address for the one building that you are asking for. So you have multiple buildings, you have to do one investment justification for each. When the building was constructed, do you have permission to make enhancements to the building? And then they'll ask you about the mission statement and how it pertains to your building and what does the building look like, all kinds of stuff. The one important thing under the application information, and this is the part that nobody ever prepares for, what are you asking for? What do you want to spend money on? How much money do you want to spend in each category? So we're going to take it back to that AEL list. If you're asking for doors and locks, I want $50,000 for doors and locks. If you're asking for training, I need $15,000 to train my staff. You have to really sort of budget that request and make sure it lines up with all of those AEL codes and what you're asking for. And they want to see that in there. As far as the background goes, and again, I'm going to give you some really broad strokes here, but when you're looking at the symbolic value of your organization or the facility itself, is it a national or historic site? What does it mean to the community, and why could it potentially be a higher target for terrorist activity? You really need to sort of paint that picture and give them as much detail. And keep in mind, the investment justification, they only give you so much space to answer these questions. When they came out with the new IJ this year, we had no idea how much room we were going to have. So we just started, pre-filling out a lot of the questions, and we had to edit it down because they limit your character count. So you have to really answer these questions to the best of your ability in a very tiny little space that, that'll get seen, right? So in terms of the risk section, now it's starting to really drill down on the threats, the vulnerabilities, and more specifically, the consequences if you don't get this funding. And now the threats and the vulnerabilities, it should be outlined in your assessment pretty clearly. But the consequences, I see a lot of assessments out there, the ones that we don't do, they don't really outline the consequences that much. And you have to make that case for, if we don't get this funding, we're high on the target list for terrorist activity because people will be killed, parishioners will be killed, students could be hurt. Again, nobody is saying it's a definite, but you have to plead your case on why you need this, and if you don't get it, what could potentially happen? And that's what they're looking for in this section. On the facility hardening side, now you're going to back up all the requests, the budget money that you're asking for, and you can get really granular with access control and surveillance cameras. This is where it really helps you to have somebody who understands what that looks like from an installation perspective to help you answer these questions. I'm going to skip ahead. Milestones. The reason why people forfeit their funds is because they cannot meet the milestones. When you first apply, you think, oh, I have 3 years to spend this money. It goes really fast. And with all the supply chain issues that we're seeing, I have a lot of clients that are having issues in meeting some of those deadlines. So you want to make sure that you outline, you know what you're doing, and you're going to meet your deadlines. The project management, somebody has to be a point of contact because you're going to get assigned a grant rep. They're going to be contacting you to make sure that you're spending your money properly. You have to document everything, send it back to them. So who is going to be responsible for all of that? And then again, the impact. Number one, and this is, they usually don't tell you this, but this past year, they did admit that if you, or not admit, they made a little announcement that if you had not received funding in the past, you had a good chance of receiving it this year. But also what that impact would look like. If you got the funds, how would it help your community? How would it keep your students safe? And this is where you sort of, again, plead your case, so to speak. All right. Now you won. What do you do next? You have to document everything that we just outlined for you in the previous slides, have all that information documented. And now when it's time to move forward with spending the money, you have to continue to document and continue to share this information with your grant reps and show them that you're keeping your project on track, right? I refer people back to the AEL list again. Here's what happens a lot of the time. People will apply for $50,000 in surveillance cameras, $20,000 for training. And then all of a sudden, when it comes down to actually installing equipment, they say, you know what, we really only need 5 cameras. Let's take the rest of that money and put it towards training or put it towards locks. You can go back and readjust those funds. You have to work with your grant rep, but you also need to know that if you didn't ask for this particular AEL code, it's going to be a little bit of a tougher battle to try and reallocate those funds. So do your research on your projects and make sure you're working with your consultant on these codes for sure, or your state rep. Something that most people don't realize, because this is a daunting process and the federal government realizes how much work is involved, and they've seen people, again, ask for extension after extension because they can't seem to get out of their own way. They can't seem to figure out the process. They realize that the management and administration piece to spending these funds was critical to a successful grant program. And so now they are, I guess in the last few years, they're allowing some of those funds to be reallocated for someone to do the management and administration of these grants, which is really helpful because when you're working with smaller institutions, they don't have the resources, the people to spend time. It's a lot of work. They don't have people to spend the time on figuring this out. Again, that's part of the work that we do. There's not a ton of money in the management and administration, but because we know it so well, we can sort of crank it out and work and coach people through the whole process. And again, this year it's 5% of the grant will go to management and administration. So the cost is covered. It's not coming out of your own pocket if you're the applicant. And then the rinse and repeat. I say this all the time. When you're looking at a grant specific, a security specific grant, a lot of the information can be used from one grant to the next to the next. If you get a really thorough assessment, you can use it for the Nsgp, you can use it for the COPS grant and some of the state and locals. So once you just sort of get into this process and you really learn the ropes, you have to keep all of that information up to date. If you add more cameras, you got to make sure it's updated. If you add new locks, you got to make sure it's updated, but you can just rinse and repeat and apply for grant funding year after year after year. And a lot of my clients do it and they win a lot of money. So just under 45 minutes. I hope that was okay.
No, that's great. And we have a ton of questions that came in. And one just that really stuck out was Krista Campbell asked, she said she was very discouraged, or she was discouraged from applying for grants in the past because her school's in a rural area and it's perceived as a low risk. But what we've seen in recent months, recent years, that doesn't matter if you're in a rural area or an urban area, the risk level's there. So how would you address that with Krista?
So for the Nsgp, they actually opened it up. People used to reference that particular grant as the UASI grant, the Urban Area Security Initiative, right? And then all of a sudden they said, well, all these other schools and nonprofits need help too. So now they've divided it into two streams of funding, one for urban areas and one for everything else. So you shouldn't be discouraged. There's definitely grant money out there that you can go after. If you're looking at the COPS grant, I don't know if she's a school, but I would just dig into what the requirements are for the COPS grant, because I think that also should help out. And then again, we've worked with all different types of institutions, not just schools and houses of worship. We've worked with hospital systems, other nonprofits, and with our team, again, we're constantly combing through databases of different types of grants and what you can use those funds for. If anything says security in there, we're going to put that in front of you. And it's all public information. The same research that we're doing, she can do it as well. It takes time. That's the only thing.
There are a few questions that are somewhat related. Mark Fletcher and Scott Mecca asked questions regarding the technology, what are technology decision factors, what is applicable, and are subscription-based software like SaaS programs available for grant funding?
Yeah, that is a question that comes up because you're looking at a grant cycle where you get an award, you have 3 years to apply those funds. So when you're looking at a SaaS model, it's a little bit challenging. I have yet to hear anyone that has pulled that off successfully. So I would, again, first depends on the type of grant. And then I would reach out to the grant rep to say, this is the product we're looking for. And I think, please don't quote me, but I think there might be some workarounds in terms of if this is a monthly budgetary number, could I just spend a year's worth of fees for this particular product? I think that might be a possibility, but I would confirm that with your grant representative.
Got it. There's a question here about private colleges. So someone asked earlier about state-funded schools. They're not eligible for the nonprofit?
Nonprofit Security Grant Program. Mm-hmm.
The Nonprofit Security Grant Program. Someone asked about the acronyms as well. So are private colleges eligible for the Nonprofit Security Program grant?
Yeah. So if it's a private college, if they are a nonprofit, any nonprofit can apply for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, at least to my knowledge. I've asked this question on several of the webinars that FEMA offers, and I'm pretty sure that's the rule, is you just have to be a nonprofit, but you also have to, it's a competitive program. They really don't like to give you a ton of information on what your likelihood is to win a grant award. They just tell you it's a competitive program. You have to go through the process and hopefully you get it. But if you want to do a little bit of research, depending on what type of institution you are, we can reach out to some of our contacts at FEMA and just say, it's this type of institution or this type of organization. Could they possibly be disqualified for any reason? And if so, why? And then again, they don't like to give a lot of this information out, but we can also ask if any other similar organizations have ever gotten the award for that particular grant program.
You mentioned earlier about having a threat assessment or a risk assessment to identify that as a starting point. Is that required for either the grant programs? Are you required to have an assessment submitted?
Yeah, it's definitely required for the Nsgp. So again, the Nsgp, it has been the most popular. They've given away year to date the most amount of money. In fact, last year, they increased their budget by $70 million, and I'm sure they're going to increase it again for fiscal year 23. But that one has 3 requirements: the mission statement, the assessment, and the investment justification. Now, we do also encourage people, like if you have any sort of police reports or insurance claims that will add to your building of your case why you're a good candidate, include them. They're not required, but those 3 items are required. I believe the COPS grant also, they want you to have an assessment. Some of the state and local ones, I believe New York State or the New York City Hate Crimes grant, I think that one also requires an assessment, but it's, you know, you have to really just look at each individual grant because there are a lot out there.
What about ESSER fundings? Isn't there almost like $1 billion of money that was allocated for school states related to COVID that has not been allocated yet?
Yeah, so I do have some information on the CARES Act, again, American Rescue, which I don't know it off the top of my head, but I can certainly share those resources and you can start digging yourself. My team is digging into it right now. But yeah, there's definitely a lot out there that you could dive into and figure out, will this pay for cameras or locks or doors or whatever?
Mm-hmm. It's Lawrence Patterson asks, great question. Are these grants available to individual schools or does the application have to come from the district?
No, I just worked with somebody. She's an amazing individual. She has, she's running her own nonprofit school specifically for, I think, kids with emotional needs or some sort of special needs category that, and she's running the whole thing herself. It's one institution. I do think she has some affiliate organizations, but it's really all on her and she's doing the whole thing herself. She's doing a really good job. So yeah, it's open.
Mark Franken asks, and you did touch upon this earlier, but what type of projects can be funded? Is it just hardware or physical systems like the examples you mentioned, or can security software be funded, like you mentioned, the SaaS software? Yeah, so again, I'm cautious around the SaaS language, but when the first step is getting the award, right? So in the category that you select, let's just use video surveillance as an example. Let's say, we need a new system. We need a whole upgrade to our system because it's not functioning properly. It's really old. It's not working with the new cameras that we have. So we need a whole upgrade. That's a really generic statement. Once you actually get the award, you can go to your grant rep and say, part of getting this whole upgrade is purchasing software. Now, that's where you have to sort of go back and forth and say, look, this is a SaaS model. I need to at least pay for one full year. And they're going to work with you on how to get around that. But the SaaS piece is a little bit tricky right now. There are still a lot of video surveillance manufacturers that will sell you a long-term license. Maybe not the maintenance that goes along with it, but that's, you might want to look at that when you're evaluating the different products. Great. Jocelyn Johnson asks, do you know of any grants that state schools, colleges, and universities can apply for? We can't receive the state grants in Louisiana. They have K-12 grants as well. So what would state schools apply for?
I want to say the COPS grant might do it. I would have to triple check that, but I did speak to an organization that was, I believe they were a state school, and they were looking into the COPS grant. I would have to triple check, and if she wants, you have my email address. I will look into it as soon as I get off the call just to confirm, and I'll let you know. Great. Let's get a bunch more questions here. So will for example, if you have a consultant like your services, Elisa, I saw this question in here, this anonymous question, can your fees be written into the grant to cover the cost as a consultant? That's a really good question. And I did not cover that. I was trying to buzz through the presentation. Whoever is doing your assessment has to be an unbiased third party, or I shouldn't even say third party. If it's somebody within your organization, they have to be unbiased to the type of equipment they're calling out for in the assessment. So I will see a lot of people or manufacturers say, oh, well, I'll do the assessment for my client. You can't do the assessment for your client. That's a conflict of interest. So getting a third party to evaluate and say, these are the types of equipment that we would recommend, without calling them or specifying them by name, because when you specify by name, that's also a little bit of a red flag to a grant reviewer. You want to be broad and general enough, but also detailed enough to say, this is the type of equipment that you really, really need in this institution. If you get the money, evaluate all the different products that are out there and come up with the best solution. So it's a little tricky. You definitely want to be careful with that.
Awesome. Dawn Lamoth asks, are any grants like retroactive? Looks like she just purchased a server a couple months ago. Can that be covered with new grants?
Also a great question. So I'm going to just reference the Nsgp. Maybe other grants are different. I'm not going to say I know every single grant that's out there, but for the Nsgp, if you apply and say, I need money for servers for my video surveillance, let's say, and then before you get the actual grant award letter, you go out and buy those servers, well, now you forfeited those funds. You cannot make the purchase from the time you said you needed the funds to the time you got the award. It has to show that you purchased it after to get that reimbursement. So I would also caution that you can't go retroactive.
Okay, let's take a few more questions here. We have 5 minutes or less.
I like the guitar in the background too, by the way. That's really nice.
Rock and roll, of course. Thank you. Hey, and your video worked just fine today, so plenty of bandwidth. That's very happy that worked.
Okay.
So Jocelyn asked, how often should assessments be done?
Good question. So the Nsgp will allow you to use the same assessment 2 years in a row, as long as you adjust it. So if I did the assessment today, and by the next time you have to resubmit, if you've installed 5 new cameras, well, you have to make that amendment that, yes, we've added 5 new cameras. So it always has to be accurate, but they will allow you to use the same assessment 2 years in a row. For your own sort of best practice, I would say you should just get one every year, because things change, and for our assessments, the ones that we do, we don't just look at your building. We look at the surrounding areas. We look at crime rates. We look at similar institutions. I have a team of researchers that will pull stats, crime stats, for different areas to, again, build that case. I'm in an area where there was recently a top shooting, and it's right in my town, and this kind of activity is happening, or that kind of terrorist activity is going on in that part of the world, and it could be tied back to our organization. All of these different little parts and pieces build your case. So I would say do it annually if you can, and try and get that detailed. I know it costs money, but sometimes it's worth it.
It's a couple more questions. So Lawrence had a rephrasing of this question earlier. So can the application come from a public school within a district directly, or does it have to be initiated from the district? Does the district need to initiate the application?
I do believe you have to work with your district. So I just got contracted to do a district in New York, and we were working with multiple districts just to sort of compare and contrast what the other districts had versus what their districts had. And then they, of course, have to go up to their more senior level folks to make the case for higher budget money. So I'm pretty sure you have to go through the ranks and through the districts for those. Again, that was just New York. Maybe it's different in other parts, but I'm pretty sure that's the answer.
Got it. There was an interesting question here. Jeff Lemon asks, can they apply to the school's foundation if it's a nonprofit? So I'm assuming it's a public school, or it's a private school, but there's actually, Jeff, do you mind just punching in there? Is it a private school or public school? Do I know if they could apply through the school's foundation, which is a nonprofit?
So that's a question that comes up a lot on some of the webinars. And if anyone missed it, FEMA gives free webinars. They're long and sometimes a little slow, but they're so worth it. They're free. Go onto the FEMA website and just, add your name to the list and you will get these invites. And I attend as many as I can because there's always new information that I'm learning. And each year there's little nuances that change here and there. So it's so worth it to just sit on some of these calls. But that is a question that comes up on almost every single webinar. You do have to be careful. I have a school and, there's one small organization that uses one area of my building. Can I use that organization since they're a nonprofit? No, you really can't. It's a little bit of common sense, but if the school is in fact part of a larger nonprofit organization, for sure you can. I would, once again, before you invest all this time, money, and effort, figure out which grant you want to go for, which one you want to spend the time applying for. Reach out to that grant representative and say, this is my school, this is the organization that's a nonprofit, can we apply? They will tell you. They're going to be, get it straight from the horse's mouth. Don't take my word for it. Don't take anyone else's word for it. These resources are available by the government and all these different governing bodies who are evaluating grant applicants. They're available to you for this reason.
Great. Thanks, Elisa. We're definitely out of time, and still some questions that still have to be answered. And we will send out a key takeaways document along with the replay of this webinar. And by the way, Krista, yeah, that is a Les Paul, a Gibson Les Paul, a good eye. And just want to remind folks, our next sessions is coming up in August. We're going to actually have a panel discussion on lessons learned from Uvalde. And we had a number of discussions about this, and there are things that we can do, when we have an incident, how can we learn from that and improve our safety and security on our schools and campuses right away. And so we're going to have a discussion on that. Stay tuned for that. Visit ZeroNow.org for more information about that and registration for that. Thank you so much, Elisa. I learned a lot today. I'm a lot smarter now than I was an hour ago. So appreciate your time and sharing your insights. And we will share Elisa's contact information if you want to reach out to her and have a discussion and learn more about grant funding for your school or organization. So thank you.